In the 41st millennium, across the stars, there have been many galactic superpowers, but very few have ever soared as high or fallen quite as far as the Eldari. Once, they commanded the stars not through brute strength, but through artistry, knowledge, and mastery of powers most races could barely comprehend. Now, they are but echoes of an empire lost to excess and haunted by the shadow of their own hubris. In today's video, I'll be exploring the vast culture and history of the Eldari, to serve as an introductory video for newcomers to the hobby, or perhaps serve as a refresh for Warhammer veterans who need to relearn the basics of this amazing faction. Thank you so much for clicking on, and I hope you enjoy. Let's start with their origins, of course, because you gotta start at the beginning. Millions upon millions of years ago, there was a galactic catastrophe known as the War in Heaven. This would be a foundational event for the entire Warhammer 40k universe, but we can't get into all those details, obviously, so I'll be sticking just to the Eldari facts, or what this faction's concerned with. On one side of the conflict were the Old Ones, these master psychics and manipulators of the warp, and these godlike creatures that were seeding the galaxy with new life and creating new species. At first with very peaceful intentions, but the War in Heaven would later force their hand to create races specifically with war in mind. On the other side were the Necrons, who were wronged by the Old Ones for many reasons that I'm not going to get into, and the Catan, their star gods of matter that were completely tethered to real space, but extremely powerful. Amongst the many races that the Old Ones would create as chaff or frontline for this war that they were fighting in, the Eldar would be their most treasured amongst them. As per the Old Ones' design, the Eldar were an extremely advanced psychic and spiritually attuned species. It's safe to assume that they were created to inherit the galaxy after the war. Their psychic potential, being unmatched by other creations, really lends itself to this theory. But sadly, things would not go according to the Old Ones' plans. The Old Ones would disappear, effectively losing the war, but the Necrons, with their now shattered Catan gods, were weary and injured from this battle that they had pyrrhically won. So the Necrons would decide to partake in a great sleep, which was essentially them going to sleep for the next 60 million years in hopes of all other sentient races dying out, essentially leaving planets and the entire galaxy ripe for the taking so that they may rebuild their rightful empire and glory across the stars. But in doing so, the Eldar were now left alone. Whatever other species were left behind post-war didn't really have a chance to stand up against the Eldar, not with their psychic powers, and even if they did have a chance against those psychic powers, their technological advancement compared to all the other races in the galaxy was just too much. The Old Ones had essentially set them up too well. So naturally, using technologies like the webway to travel across the galaxy nigh instantly, and advanced material like the Wraithbone to create anything that they possibly needed for their galactic conquest, the Eldari began to spread amongst the stars and would quite easily dominate the known galaxy. Before I continue on explaining how the Eldar dominated the galaxy with these technologies, I need to explain to you exactly what these technologies are. The Webway is an ancient, extra-dimensional network of tunnels and pathways that allow the Eldar to travel across the galaxy without entering the warp. It's essentially a pocket dimension in between the immaterial and real space. Unlike warp travel, which is very dangerous and chaotic, the Webway is completely stable, fast, and hidden. It's a relic of the Eldari's once great empire. It was originally built by the Old Ones and expanded upon by the Eldari, and it allowed them to move between planets and even entire star systems in complete secret, and far faster than they could have ever traveled in real space. As for Wraithbone, Wraithbone is a psychically grown, semi-organic material used by the Eldari to build almost everything. From armor to weapons to cities, spacecrafts, and even constructs that can house Eldari souls. It is shaped not by machines, but by bone singers, Eldari artisans who channel psychic energy into form. The material is alive, in a sense, and responsive to thought. It's self-repairing, and it is connected to the Eldari's collective spirit. In simpler terms, it essentially crystallized psychic energy, and Eldari, being masters of the psychic, have the ability to form and shape this through thought and song into whatever they need. It is an incredibly advanced material, and it really set the Eldari up to be a dominant force in the galaxy, and even after their eventual decline, which we'll get into more, it still keeps them in the game and in the fight due to simply how advanced it truly is. It is important to note that during this pivotal time, somewhere during or after the War in Heaven, and the expansion of the Eldari Empire, the seeds for what would later become their pantheon of gods and mythology would begin to form. We'll get into this more later, but Eldar remember this time very differently, and they believe that they were created by their now Eldari gods and everything like that. But as the readers, we know that the old ones had a much more involved hand in creating this species. There's many theories around what the Eldari gods originally were. Were they supercharged Eldari created by the old ones to lead them? Were they great war machines that would become so venerated through collective belief that they would ascend to godhood, or something along those lines, something in between? We don't really know. All we know is that the original belief and the stories and figures that would later become the Eldari gods, the seeds were laid here, the foundation was laid during this time period. But now we can get into the Eldari Empire and essentially their golden age. So like I've been alluding to, the Eldari would eventually expand this utopian empire that dominated all of the known galaxy. Their planets were paradise worlds, they were technologically supreme, they had next to no challengers anymore, and if any conflict did occur, then automatons or other automatic robotic responses were sent to deal with it. So no Eldari life was ever lost. It was kind of nice to live as an Eldar, as you can imagine, during this time. But the thing is, due to the supremacy that the Eldar had become so accustomed to, there was a deep-seated arrogance that began to bloom during this time. In the later parts of the Eldari Empire's lifespan, this prosperity and this abundance would begin to inflict boredom upon the highly emotionally sensitive Eldar, and this boredom would begin infecting a large part of the Eldari Empire. It would eventually form into cults. Originally, underground cults began pushing boundaries or experimenting with taboos, but this playful notion of just trying to expand their horizons began to corrupt and turn into a horrible hedonistic actions. Now, as this began happening, and it happened quite rapidly, this infection or poison began to spread through the Eldari Empire at an abysmal rate. But there were a few sects of Eldar that saw this coming and began to try and separate themselves away from the Empire and go back to the traditional ways. The earliest amongst these groups were called the Exodites, and we'll get into them more later in the section where I break down all the subfactions or kindreds as they're known. But the Exodites were essentially the first section of Eldari that went away from the main empire and went to the outer fringes of their galactic territory, and they essentially inhabited the farthest worlds that they possibly could, and they rejected modern technology and went back to a very primitive way of life as to forge themselves through discipline and hard work, essentially to reconnect with nature and to remember the difficulties of sustaining yourself and not having everything done for you. And then another sect that would later separate were something called the Craft World Eldar. The Craft World Eldari were these Eldari that would go on these massive maiden voyages around the stars, and these maiden voyages would have many different reasons, but the main point is that the Eldari on these craft worlds, and the craft worlds were like continent-sized ships that would drift through space, right? The craft worlds would return to the Eldari Empire and its planets after their maiden voyage, and they would see the horrific hedonism that the Eldari were beginning to partake in, and most were absolutely disgusted. Finding any refugees that they could upon these worlds that wanted to reject or escape this reality, the Craft World Eldari would leave with as many sane Eldar as they could possibly find, and just begin traveling into the deep void of space, trying to avoid some dreadful collapse that they could sense coming across the horizon. Now, if you'll remember, back in the War in Heaven section, as I was previously mentioning, the Eldari had this ability to, through their collective belief, summon gods, as does anything with a large enough presence in the warp because of how powerful or bright their soul is. Humanity and other species have this capability, but the Eldari are most likely the most warp significant entities because of how much pressure and weight their soul brings because of their psychic attunement to the warp. Well, little did they know that all this hedonism that was not in worship of any of their previous traditional pantheon was serving a being, or was creating a new being within the warp. As the warp was manipulated and twisted by the horrible debauchery happening in real space in droves due to the Eldari population, all this malignant energy began to form into what would become a new chaos god. See, Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch all existed in their own way during this time, but there was yet to be the fourth god, or at least as we know in real space, because warp and time and the dark gods and everything operate very weirdly. But as far as the real space timeline is concerned, Slaanesh, the god of excess, had not been born yet. But soon, he would be, and it was all the Eldari's fault. See, Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess, was born from the collective corruption of the Eldar, and it released an intense psychic shockwave that instantaneously killed billions of Eldar, ripping their souls out of their bodies and immediately being consumed to feed the newborn baby of evil. On top of this, worlds that were close to the site in real space where the birth of Slaanesh essentially tore a wound in reality, where the warp and real space began to connect. And if you'll imagine real space like a fabric, there was a tear in the fabric, and through the fabric there was the warp. And any Eldari worlds close to this tear were immediately consumed and incinerated from their very core. So the Eldari were essentially living a absolute cataclysm, a Ragnarok of the species. And it is estimated that about half of all Eldari lives were instantaneously ended due to this cataclysm. This tear that I keep mentioning does actually have a name. It's called the Eye of Terror, and it's a warp rift where Slaanesh was born, and it scarred the galaxy permanently, and it would remain there. Post Eldari fall, this would open the door to several other species beginning to ramp up in power and essentially fill the power vacuum. The surviving Eldari were now considered soul-cursed, and Slaanesh would prize their soul the most amongst any meal or any addiction that the god possessed. So all Eldar are marked, basically, and they are trying to stave off death or protect their souls as to not strengthen Slaanesh any further. And all Eldar struggle with this in different ways, which we'll get into later, as we cover more of their sub-factions and kindreds. It's also important to note that this post-collapse reality is where most kindreds and sub-factions began to form, because due to the horror of what they had survived, whatever Eldar remained, all had different thoughts on how to handle the newborn Slaanesh and how they would survive in the galaxy that they knew now. Before I get into cultures and subcultures and kindreds and all this stuff, I think it's important that I cover at least some of the most important and pertinent gods within their ancient pantheon, because a lot of their subcultures are delineated by which god they worship and which god they want to revive or which god they're currently serving, because it's one of the few that survived. There's a lot of really interesting stuff about their gods, and honestly, if I wanted to cover the pantheon, the Eldari pantheon in its totality, I'm probably going to need to make that its own video. But for now, I'll just cover about 4 or 5 of the most important or cool gods that I think matter. There's not much lore on this guy, but I think he's just pertinent because he's so important to the craft world Eldar. His name is Asurion. He was the king of the gods, and his symbol was of light and order, and he was often represented through flame. He essentially serves as a guidepost for traditionalist Eldar that are trying to survive the 41st millennium right now. He upholds many of the original principles, beliefs, and tenets of traditional Eldar society. Next up is Cain, the violent and reckless war god of the Eldar. He was shattered by Slaanesh only because he was actually one of the very few gods that would survive the immediate birth of Slaanesh, seeing as most of them were almost instantly consumed by the dark god. But Cain was too powerful to be consumed instantaneously, and he would take up his mythical sword and begin doing battle with Slaanesh in the war. And Cain couldn't defeat Slaanesh, but Slaanesh couldn't defeat Cain either. Cain would only fall due to the fact that so many of his original believers or Eldari souls were being consumed at such a rapid rate that the belief system behind him began to collapse. And so he shattered during the mythical fight, and the craft world Eldar would actually go around gathering and containing these shards of Cain, as they're known now. They were like living avatars of Cain, where the Eldar now actually summon these shards or these small portions of Cain's spirit into battle as this titanic force on the battlefield. It's really cool, but each shard only contains obviously a fraction of the total god's power. Next up is Segirach, which is one of my favorite Eldari gods, and he essentially, as the trickster god of the Eldari pantheon, hid away and escaped Slaanesh's ire, and he fled into the Webway, where he would form the Harlequins, which is a very specific and mysterious sect of Eldari, which I'll get into a little bit more. But he essentially has a great plan or a great scheme, a final joke that he wants to play on Slaanesh that will apparently defeat Slaanesh and bring the Eldar back to their former glory. Next up is Isha. Some people include her as one of the gods that survived the Slaaneshi scourge, but it's actually not confirmed whether or not she survived. But Isha, if she is alive, was the essentially mother goddess, and she represented healing and harvest in the Eldari pantheon. The legend says that Isha was captured by Nurgle right before Slaanesh could consume her, Nurgle being the chaos god of pestilence and disease. And he would take her back to his garden, where he would try and share the gifts of his plague and pestilence with her. But Isha, being the goddess of healing, has been essentially shrugging off these diseases, and he is trying to find something that will eventually bring her to his side. And apparently Nurgle is infatuated with Isha, if she is alive and she is there. It's also believed that Isha, being the goddess of healing, whispers cures of all the sickness that Nurgle gives to her across the winds to her mortal followers, so that they might be able to heal it once Nurgle tries to infect real space with it. It's a pretty interesting theory, but again, it's just a legend. I don't think that it's confirmed whether or not Isha actually survived. Next up is Yened. He's definitely dead. He's been kablooied, but there was a ancient prophecy that many Eldar still believe that once all the Eldari died, then all the Eldari's death would summon Yened again, would stoke the embers of his soul, and that Yened would lead a great conquest against Slaanesh and free all Eldari souls consumed by Slaanesh by slaying the Chaos God and bringing them back, which is a pretty interesting theory. And there are actually pertinent sub-faction that we're about to get into that follows Yened and is trying to come up with interesting ways to work around that prophecy, but we'll get into that more soon. Now that I've sloppily described the important figures within the Eldar pantheon, I think that we can finally get into the sub-factions, or as they're known in universe to the Eldari, kindreds of the Eldar, which are essentially different groupings of Eldar that hold their own unique belief systems or ways of staving off Slaanesh, or enough delineation from the greater Eldari Empire and its original tenets to make it its own sub-faction. First up are the Asuryani. Asurani? I think it's Asuryani, or Craft World Eldar, the ones that were on those big continent-sized ships that I told you about. Well, as you know, they escaped on Craft Worlds, which were these huge spacefaring continent-sized cities, basically, that were completely self-sustaining. They left the Empire before the fall, sensing the oncoming corruption, and as a result of the cataclysm and what they had discovered on their own planets back millions of years ago, they live extremely strict and structured lives to try and avoid corruption. They follow these things called paths, which are essentially kind of, you can think of them as careers, where there's the path of the warrior, the seer, the artist, or whatever other path or discipline that you can imagine a person partaking. And the reason why they do this is that they focus hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years on a singular path to discipline and channel all of their emotions into one singular goal. But then eventually, once they've mastered this path, they have to choose another, as to not become obsessed or excessive in their emotion in relation to this, as to not feed Slaanesh. This path thing, as I might have mentioned before, was developed by Asurion, the king of the gods. One thing that I think is important to delineate for every Eldar kindred is that they all have different ways of staving off Slaanesh and essentially protecting, or at the very least keeping, their souls of fallen Eldar from Slaanesh's grasp. And for the Craft World Eldar, they use these things called Spirit Stones, which are essentially these crystals where they immediately channel the soul of the dead Eldar into the crystal, and then they store it within something called an infinity circuit. It's a soul network that lives inside the Craft World ships. It's probably the most important thing on the Craft World ships, and it's why Eldari will go to any means possible to keep their Craft World safe, because if the infinity circuit is lost or broken, all those souls will be immediately consumed by Slaanesh and no longer able to be resurrected or reincarnated should Slaanesh ever be defeated, and it will also just make Slaanesh more powerful and doom those souls to an eternity of damnation and suffering. So it's very, very important for them to keep those souls safeguarded. Another really cool thing about Spirit Stones in Craft World Eldar, that soul network serves as a nexus of knowledge and willpower from previous ancestors of the Craft World, and these souls will help guide the living and guard against psychic threats on the Craft World ship. One other cool thing is that they can place them in Wraithbone constructs. So there are things known as Wraith Guard or Wraith Knights, where it's actually being piloted by previous Eldar souls, concentrating their energy into controlling this construct. It's pretty cool, and it's one of the things that the Craft World used to maintain their power. Another really cool and important factor of Craftworld Eldar that separate them from the rest of the kindreds are these things called Phoenix Lords. They are legendary founders of something called aspect temples, which are philosophies of war that make up the overarching nexus that makes up their war philosophy as a species. And each of these Phoenix Lords embodies perfection in their specific philosophy or tactic for war. They wear ancient armor that absorbs the souls of their successors, that makes them effectively immortal, and these guys are absolute demigods in battle. There's a couple examples that make them pretty cool, like Aserman, which was the original Phoenix Lord, Jane Zar, which is the Phoenix Lord of the Howling Banshees, Fuegon, which is Phoenix Lord of the Fire Dragons, and Malgon Ra, which is the Phoenix Lord of the Dark Reapers. All these guys are super cool, and each of them deserves their own video, but you get the point. The summary of Phoenix Lords is that they are immortal warriors that embody perfection in every path of what it means to be a warrior for the Eldar, and they lead Eldar craft worlds into battle. There are also many of them that have disappeared for periods of time and come back during the Eldar's greatest time of need, but we'll cover that when we cover Phoenix Lords in their own dedicated videos. Next up are the Exodites, the ancient sect of the Eldari Empire that separated first amongst all others, if you remember the history section previously in the video. The Eldar left before the fall, and they settled on Maiden Worlds, which were these lush tribal planets that were largely unsettled and uncultivated by the ancient Eldari Empire. And they found comfort in a more tribal, nature-bound lifestyle. Their souls bond with these things called world spirits, which are essentially kind of like the craft world infinity circuits, but it's connected more to the planet's soul, or it creates a network of a planetary soul. So much like the infinity circuits network of souls that guides craft world Eldar on their ships, Exodite Eldar have something that channels all the souls of fallen Eldar into the planet itself, and the souls of the Eldar live within nature and create that network of psychic protection and guidance for the primitive Exodites. And this seemingly primitive nature is actually just their own self-inhibited discipline as to stave off Slaanesh with hard work and dedication in taking care of nature and protecting the planet, not only to protect the wildlife and the fauna and everything, but also to protect the fallen Eldar and their souls that literally are imbued with the planet that they reside on. It's really, really cool. Next up for the most unique kindreds are the Harlequins, which I think are probably my personal favorite kindred of Eldari. The Harlequins are an enigmatic faction within the Eldari. They serve both as warriors and performers, and they are devoted followers of Segarach. But they have a few primary focuses or goals, many of which are not known by the greater Eldari population, but only to themselves and us as the readers. So they primarily to the Eldar are known as performers. They perform these things called masks. The masks depict history and mythos from Eldari, like ancient Eldari stories. So they're basically a bunch of theater kids, but their main mission in performing the masks is reminding all sects of Eldar, anything from Exodites to Craftworld to their now distant cousins Dark Eldar or Drukhari. But they're like diplomats across all of these different fractured factions, and they teach everyone the ancient history of the Eldari culture and empire to try and remind them of where they came from. Now, sometimes it's in hopes of being educational, and in other times it reminds them of what they need to work back towards. But the thing is, behind these masks, there are often ulterior motives with the Harlequins. You see, the Harlequins are, at their heart, schemers, like the Laughing God, their trickster god, and they are always trying to work towards a scheme to defeat Slaanesh in some way, or accomplish something that will set up a domino effect years and years and years later that will eventually pull off a scheme somewhere down their timeline, only known between them and Segarach, of course. They also maintain the protection of something called the Black Library. The Black Library is this cutout section of the webway that is protected by Segarach and the Harlequins, and it is a library that contains knowledge, forbidden knowledge about chaos and the warp, and it's this fountain of resource and wisdom that Segarach gives to the Harlequins to better educate them and mold them towards his great final prank. So ultimately, their ulterior motive behind all of this is to combat chaos, and specifically, eventually slay or defeat Slaanesh, according to Segarach's grand plan. Now, what that is, we don't know as the readers, and no one else really knows either. The Harlequins are a very mysterious and interesting faction within Warhammer that leaves room for a lot of theorizing and theory crafting about what they're doing, what they're up to, and how they might eventually offer some massive turning point to the plot as the universe of Warhammer develops inevitably. Next up are the Ynnari. I think that that the Ynnari are very interesting, especially since they're relatively the new kids on the block, with this new pivotal plot that the Eldar as a faction in Warhammer are going down now. The Ynnari actually worship Yned, the god of death that I mentioned previously in the Pantheon section. They believe that the god of death and his prophecy is the key to their salvation and the key to defeating chaos. But they aim to awaken Yned fully and actually revive the god by guiding soul energy in a slightly different way than the prophecy suspects. They're trying to find alternatives to every single Eldar dying, because that's, believe it or not, a pretty risky gamble, and it's difficult to convince other Eldar that this is the way to go when you're essentially telling them, hey, you know, Yned, all of you need to die for our plan to go through. That doesn't really go over very well at the dinner table, as you can imagine. So they're trying to find a way to circumvent this and stir Yned's spirit without having to have every Eldar die. They're led by a key character called Yvraine, and I'm not going to go into her because I didn't go to every other kindred's main character, if you will, but she's essentially the prophet for Yned, and she channels Yned's power in real space. She got combined with a shattered fragment of Yned and stirred the ancient god, and now she actually serves as a way to protect Ynnari souls, where she can siphon in Eldar souls of those who die around her and protect them within herself. This is a power granted to her by the Shard of Yned. They also use Spirit Stones, just like Craftworld Eldar, as a backup soul protection to this primary method through Yvraine. But it's pretty interesting, and their story is really compelling. It's come to a little bit of a standstill, but that's lore shenanigans and stuff that we'll get into when the Ynnari get their own dedicated video. But they are essentially the kindred of Eldar that follow the Death God and his prophecy, and they are all working towards a future where Yned can slay Slaanesh and free the dead souls that Slaanesh is tormenting back to prosperity and back to life. In modern day 40k, the Eldari are very few in number, but they're still extremely powerful and have ancient knowledge that most other species don't have access to. Due to how old Eldar are, each life is precious and irreplaceable. Every single time an Eldar dies, that is thousands upon thousands of years of knowledge and artistry and mastery being lost in an instant. It's part of the reason why the soul stones and everything are still viable, not only to not empower Slaanesh and allow the soul to be consumed and tormented, but also keeping that knowledge and that willpower and everything that soul knew in life is extremely important, because it's endless and endless libraries worth of knowledge and experience. As you can suspect after me explaining the kindreds, many of the goals vary, but it varies between survival, vengeance, rebuilding, and awakening their now shattered gods. There are still major players in galactic events, but they are, no matter what, a dwindling species. There's an overall tone that they're drifting further and further into like this extinction zone, where eventually all Eldari may perish. As you can imagine, this is just a beginning general breakdown video, so there's so much more to explore regarding their gods, every sub-faction, their technology, their prophecies, their mythos, their history, everything. There's so much to the Eldar. I think that they're an amazing faction in Warhammer, and I hope that I did a good job of convincing you that there's much more to these guys than just being elves in the far distant future in space, you know? Because I think that there's a lot that separates these from other, you know, elves from other universes and fictions that all feel kind of samey, in my opinion. I think the Eldar do a really good job of feeling independent and unique compared to all that, because they just have so much compelling lore that make them wholly unique for Warhammer 40k. But yeah, no, make sure to like and subscribe if you liked the video, and thank you so much for your support.